I call Jacinda Ardern.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It's my pleasure to rise on behalf of Labour and make a contribution to this first reading debate. I first just want to query with the Minister her decision to refer it to the Social Services Select Committee. I would have thought the rationale behind sending it actually probably to either the Law and Order or Justice and Electoral Select Committee would have been a much more useful decision, given particularly that the likes of those two committees have dealt with things like extended supervision orders and other issues that can be quite confronting on Bill of Rights issues and need to be properly weighed up, and those are select committees who have had to deal with those issues. I'm sure the Social Services Select Committee will do a fine job, but it just seems wrongly placed, because at the end of the day, these are criminal justice decisions that are being made. Mr Speaker, of course there will be absolute consensus across this House around the need to protect our most vulnerable citizens in New Zealand, and children are amongst those citizens. And we are always welcome and willing to support initiatives that are well placed to do that. We, for instance, even when the Vulnerable Children's Bill came up, took the opportunity to highlight those areas where we thought there were useful mechanisms in place to protect children. That doesn't, of course, remove our ability to critique when we think there's the absence of those ideas. But I want to raise that in arguing and debating for bills like this, we actually are already missing some very simple opportunities to put in place those protections. For instance, it's all well and good for us to be debating this child sex offenders register. But what about the fact that in the Vulnerable Children's Bill, we have a requirement now on NGOs or anyone who's working with children on the front line for them to take up the role of making sure they check their workforce and ensure that they are properly able to work with children. So carrying out police checks will be part of that. Doesn't matter, of course, that the government's now putting in requirements that they will have to pay for that via a bill they have before the House at the moment. Secondly, the government has also removed the ability of those NGOs to ask SIFs to do a check on individuals that they're employing to check that they are the right people to be working with children. So on the one hand, we're saying we want to create greater checks and balances, but on the other, we're removing the ability of NGOs to do that job properly. It seems counterintuitive. So our argument is, let's get the basics right. Carmel Sepuloni's bill on registering of social workers, another prime example. If we want to make sure we're protecting young people, a very simple thing we could do is make sure we have registration of social workers in New Zealand, and we don't even have that. So again, let's get back to basics. That doesn't preclude us being able to do things like this, but let's get the basics right. And I look forward to debating that bill hopefully tomorrow. But to come to the detail on some of this bill, which Labour is supporting to select committees so that we can look at some of the issues that we have a few concerns around, and also some of the issues, obviously, that we would support. Now, the explanatory general policy statement for this bill obviously says up front that the commission of sexual offences against children is a serious problem, causes significant and long-lasting harm, no question there. Information sharing between relevant agencies is recognised as an effective way to minimise the risk of harm from re-offending by known child sex offenders. We also must add, however, that the research and evidence definitely suggests that the ability to rehabilitate these individuals is undermined if ever these registries become public. That's a really important point for us to keep in mind, because as much as there is public pressure around opening up information like this, it actually undermines our ability to keep young people safe. Now, that seems counterintuitive. The easy political thing to do is to say, let's just put all that detail out there. That actually makes it harder to safely reintegrate someone and ensure that we rehabilitate them properly so they never offend again. And there is research and evidence around that fact. And we cannot and should not play politics around that if, in fact, that is the right thing to do in terms of trying to keep people safe in the long run. So look, yes, Keeping a register absolutely has benefits, but that register must be kept within the government departments who can make sure that they use that information appropriately and in the best interest of children and their communities. The explanatory note then goes on to say that the Child Protection Child Sex Offender Register Bill requires all child sex offenders to register if they're aged over 18 years when the offence was committed and convicted of a qualifying offence. I think it's up to the Select Committee to make sure that that list of qualifying offences is the appropriate list. I've had a quick look through it. A lot of it seems to make sense. The one issue that I'm genuinely unsure of but would like to test at Select Committee is that we do have to be careful with some of the historical offences on our statutes or that people currently hold convictions for. Pre-homosexual law reform aren't actually the kinds of convictions that we want to be captured in a bill like this. And I think that's just one of those tricky legislative questions that we need to ask at Select Committee so we know that we are only including the right people in this particular bill. It also goes on to say that we want to ensure that you can register at the any offender who's found guilty of a corresponding offence in a foreign jurisdiction. Look, makes sense. A lot of individuals are being deported back to New Zealand prior to finishing their custodial sentence. Again, I think that what we have to be mindful here of is just actually the practical implications. Sounds good on paper. We actually don't even yet have an information sharing agreement that's been practically implemented between us and, for instance, Australia. I think we're all in agreement it's a good idea, but as a Select Committee, if there are blockages to that, we should be talking about that because it is holding up our ability to not just do this work, but even to implement some elements of our extended supervision order legislation. And we've seen already some horrific cases where that's not the intention of the Parliament to have those individuals let off the hook when they come back into New Zealand. One of the other points that is made is that all registered offenders when residing in the community will be required to provide a range of personal information to a central register administered by the New Zealand Police. Registered offender must update the information annually within 72 hours of any change of details and at least 48 hours prior to travel. Just one issue there that I would like to discuss again, discussed at Select Committee, is that who then is making sure that that residential address is appropriate? We've already seen cases in New Zealand where someone has been released to an address that's actually within a very close proximity to victims. And here we have a reporting mechanism, but it doesn't seem that there's any check in that reporting mechanism to ensure that that is an appropriate residence for that individual. So we need to make sure that we've got that mechanism in place, otherwise it becomes quite redundant. And if indeed the people checking that appropriateness, which you would assume would be probation, we've already seen some areas where that process has fallen down. So again, are we resourcing those individuals to do this job properly? Who will be monitoring, for instance, that people are staying within the residence that they are listing? Will we be privately contracting that role out? Because we've seen the issues that can present. How can we make sure that the current poor management that we've seen around monitoring of offenders in the community is done properly? So these are all things that make a scheme like this utterly redundant unless we have proper checks and balances in place. So these are all questions that we'd ask. I also want to add in, because it seems appropriate, and actually there's an assumption in this bill that when a sex offender is released into the community that they've got accommodation, they simply need to go and register that and everything therefore is tickety-boo. Part of our problem with reintegration and rehabilitation is the lack of availability of appropriate accommodation in the first place. I have seen scenarios where offenders it's been decided by parole that an offender is ready for release, ready to be monitored back in the community. They've been unable to be released because of the lack of appropriate accommodation. This has to be a part of a proper, well-functioning correction system to ensure we have that kind of accommodation available in the first place. So we're kind of skipping a bit of a step and making that assumption in the first place. The other thing that we would like to see discussed is If, for instance, you, after a period of 10 years, haven't reoffended, there's been no issues, everyone is satisfied with the way an individual has reintegrated, what is the mechanism to be removed from the register? We heard the Minister make some vague comment about it.
I'm sorry to have to interrupt the member, but her time has well expired.